I'm really grateful for the invitation. This has been great so far. And I was discussing with a couple of people the feeling of being first back to a workshop, or one of the first. So I'm especially grateful for letting us all be rusty and half-baked. Over the last decade, content moderation has earned a great deal of public and policy attention, been debated in major newspapers, on the floor of Congress, and this is good. Platforms have taken trust and safety more seriously over the last decade. Detection tools have become more sophisticated. More attention is being paid to the labor that's required. At the same time, the thorny problems have grown thornier. The techniques that harassers and propagandists and hate groups use have become more developed, and content moderation itself has become more politicized. Also in this time, what counts as content moderation and what earns most of our attention, and again, when I say our, I mean the press, policymakers, but also academics, has solidified. I think that the pull of high-profile cases, our attention to the biggest platforms over some of the other ones, and the latest controversies shapes our attention to the phenomenon itself. And inside the platforms, this process of professionalization of the people who do trust and safety, which again is a good thing in general, ends up affirming and reifying specific approaches to content moderation and perceptions about what the task is. And importantly, the way that Silicon Valley has turned to our fields for solutions, again, maybe a good thing in principle, tends to orient us towards problem solving and putting out the fires that they are encountering. I think there are bigger questions to be asked about the power of platforms, but the shape of our attention to this problem, the very definition of content moderation itself, can obscure aspects of this power, and I think we would do well to scrutinize this. These are also complex organizations doing many overlapping things. I was struck by a detail in an article in 2019 that was telling us that Facebook was sort of getting its act together around issues like Myanmar. But they had this quote where they said, the new team began, this is sort of crisis response team, after Facebook employees realized last year that there were 30 internal teams that had a hand in the company's Myanmar response. And in the article, it's a dig, like, look at how sort of awkward and clumsy Facebook is, or a good that they're getting their act together. But I took something different from that. I take that content moderation, whatever that is much more than whatever trust and safety is doing. And we would do well to not equate the two. It also reminds me that there is important discursive work going on that ends up clarifying and polishing certain practices such that they seem clear, effective, definable, and defensible. And what I want to think about today, and see what you think of it, is this way some practices that to me look a lot like moderation, they're part of a moderation intervention, somehow get defined away as being something else. And I think in doing so, they avoid getting tangled up into at least the speech debates that happen in the US so prominently, from regulatory scrutiny, from certain kinds of questions being asked. And I think this talk will line up really well with some of the things that Ellen was saying this morning. I think if I had lost my slides, I could just put up that picture of the car's rearview mirror and talk about the way that we may be working on problems that are already out of date, and how do we sort of anticipate ones that are coming. But there's a conceptual question. So what are the boundaries of content moderation? How did they get drawn, and by whom? Who has the power to define the problem, or which kind of problem something is? Here's the half-baked slide, but I'll do it anyway. So let me think about two elements of platforms that we're all familiar with, but that I think very often get treated as entirely separate elements, separate projects. One being content moderation, and the other being algorithmic recommendation. This distinction is sustained in the public discussion, in the press discussion. I think it shows up a lot in the policy discussion as these being two different concerns. And I think too often it shows up in our scholarship as well. These things are seen as involving different kinds of expertise, mapping to different aspects of the institutional structure of the platform itself. And in the end, they're framed as very different projects. They think about users differently, and they raise different concerns. And in some ways, we almost can treat them as sort of diametrically opposed. I'm going to argue that they're not. But if we think of content moderation as generally selecting out something that we don't want, we often think of algorithmic recommendation as selecting for something that we do want, or something that users want. This ends up framing different discussions, right? So we tend to orient our discussion about content moderation around harms, whereas the questions about recommendation are more about engagement. The technical challenges look different, so the challenge of detecting the things that we have decided are harmful or not allowed versus the question of sort of personalization and ranking, deciding sort of what goes on top. I would say until very recently, these were very different positions in the companies themselves. So until recently, trust and safety was much more peripheral. If you ask the sort of senior leadership where they have to spend their most thinking, trust and safety was often a smaller concern. And I think only in the last couple of years has become more important. Whereas algorithmic recommendation, at least for a platform like Facebook or YouTube, is sort of a crucial element of the business as well as the design. And then when we start to ask questions about what could go wrong, right, we tend to focus in the content moderation discussion on removal, right? Which things are being taken away, which things should have been taken away. And that gets us tangled, especially in the US and the West, into a kind of speech question, right? Was it right to kick someone off? Was it right to have deleted a post? Should we have removed something that was going to hurt? And when we talk about recommendation, we tend to get in these questions that are much more familiar to the debates about ethical AI, questions about whether the systems are fair, whether there are kind of structural biases in the systems themselves. And I think we could see, and Joris and Patty can correct me if they see more subtle examples, but certainly when you look at the legal efforts in the US and even in Europe, most of the discussion about content moderation is thinking about removal, right? Notification about what to take down, things that are harmful. And when they get to talking about algorithms, the frame, again, is quite different. It's about making sure there isn't bias in the system. So we can ask one question, which is like, well, okay, we're treating these things as different. How are they alike, right? We can have a conceptual argument that says, well, anything that gets recommended means something else wasn't recommended. So we know in principle, there's kind of this game about things that gain more visibility and gain less. Tyner Booker in her work makes this point really well, that the people who are using platforms are often kind of fighting for a sense of visibility. And the sense of invisibility is tantamount to not getting to participate at all, right? Even though the content is there, right? It just didn't achieve its audience. So we can make a separate kind of conceptual point that says whatever is not removed is circulated. So if you're not moderating, then you have allowed something. If you did recommend something and something else didn't get recommended, these are kind of like always doing both things, right? To remove something means very much not to recommend it. To recommend something means to displace something else. But let's ask a more specific question, which is how do they overlap, right? How are these practices interconnected now? And what I want to talk about in the paper is that major platforms have been exploring and expanding the use of the recommendation tools as a way to moderate, right? I'm going to talk particularly about the policies of Facebook and YouTube on borderline content. That's their phrase for it, but I want to highlight that this is a much wider spread practice than even the platforms are acknowledging. And it is because it's not appearing in these discussions and because of our overwhelmingly focus on removal, I think it's being under-discussed in all the thinking about content moderation. So what happens when we think about recommendation as moderation or moderation by other means? And as a kind of conceptual exercise, what things get distinguished that aren't necessarily distinct? Right? Who gets to define some things as moderation and a speech concern and some things as recommendation and a ranking concern? Okay, so I want to talk about reduction. Here's just sort of one example. This was back in July 2021 when US President Biden said that Facebook was killing people because they were not doing a good enough job about sort of anti-COVID vaccine information. Facebook responded very pointedly. They said they're doing lots of work. And they had this phrase, when we see misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines, we take action against it. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've removed over 18 million instances of COVID-19 misinformation. We have also labeled and reduced the visibility of more than 167 million pieces of COVID-19 content. I like this because it's sort of like in plain sight. This is not a widespread thing that Facebook talks about, but here it is when they want to trumpet the fact that they're doing a lot of work. They highlight that these are both elements of what they do, and there's a nice reminder that like one is of a quite dramatically bigger scale than the other one. This is just one example, right? So if our debates about content moderation, especially in the press, tend to focus on removal because it's tasty to think about like, can you kick off a sitting president or what happens when you remove someone like Alex Jones? There are lots and lots of mechanisms, remedies, Eric Goldman would call them, for dealing with content that platforms want to moderate away, right? There's removal and suspension, that's one. There's age barriers, geo-blocking, safe search distinctions. There's warnings and fact-checking and labels and interstitials. There's prompts and nudges and reminders to behave better. There's hashtag blocking to sort of not deliver up search results in some ways. There are then penalties like strike systems and temporary holds for a short period of time, long period of time. There's demonetization, right? So you can sort of punish through money rather than removal. And then there's reduction, which I want to talk about today. This obsession with removal in our discussion obscures all of these things, even though they are clearly part of the sort of array of tools that platforms use. So two platforms have been most clear about this. Now, I don't know if like posting 3 corporate blog posts is exactly clear, but at least they're talking about it. People like me go find it, but I'm not sure that means anything for other users. So in January 2019, YouTube announced the 4 R's of responsibility. They meant remove, raise, reward, and reduce. Remove is traditionally taking down videos. Raise is kind of promoting good, sort of counter speech or high quality videos. Reward is the financial part, the demonetization, and then reduce. And they were saying this was kind of a synthesis of many elements of their moderation strategy. This was already in place. It had been running for several months, maybe longer, but certainly for several months. And what they say they're going to do, you can read a bit of this quote on the left that comes out of this blog post, to reduce the spread of content that comes close to but doesn't quite cross the line of violating our community guidelines. And they have 2 categories of things they're worried about. One is borderline content, which they will sort of define later, and content that could misinform users in harmful ways. So harmful misinformation, borderline content. In the document, which is interestingly described as a continuity rather than a change, because they're linking it back to things like clickbait policies and engagement-based policies, all sort of algorithmic quality concerns, right? But now addressing some pretty traditional moderation concerns, right? Misinformation, conspiracy, and harmful content. They will also assure in this document that all that stuff will still be there. It can be found. If you know the links, it'll be there. It just won't be delivered quite as widely. Facebook made a similar statement using a similar phrase, which is interesting. Mark Zuckerberg's post in November 2018, a few months before, although I think YouTube was doing it first, they similarly suggest that they're going to reduce the visibility of borderline content that they see as a very effective strategy to limit distribution and virality. They launched this policy in 2019. They published some guidelines in 2020. And for them, borderline content, this policy applies to 3 things. So it's basically harmful misinformation, basically borderline content, similar as YouTube, and it's also low quality content. So that does include things like duplicates and clickbait and a series of other things that they lump in there. What I will suggest is that while these 2 companies have been most explicit about this, this practice is much more widespread than the 2 of them, and has been used not only just for misinformation, but across the classic trust and safety concerns. So borderline content becomes a definition that literally says any content that approaches the borderline being whatever rule they drew, right? If we extend the definition a little bit, and this is why I like the term reduction rather than borderline content or shadow banning, which I'll come to in a minute. If we extend the definition a bit, we can see a whole family resemblance of practices that are happening across all the major platforms that we tend to think about in the US at least. So Twitter has acknowledged that they reduce the visibility of misinformation, especially around vaccinations information, election information. LinkedIn and TikTok have both made oblique reference in some of their policies to limiting the visibility of certain content. Sometimes they will tell me these things, even though I can't find it on their published content. Instagram introduced, they also have Facebook's policy about borderline content. Then they also introduced this thing called sensitive content control. That was framed as the ability for the user to kind of dial up or dial down what they were getting in their recommendations. But in reality, what it was saying, do I want it to be not limited, limited default, and limited more, which meant they were already limiting it, right? The recommendation mechanism already had a sort of filtering going on, and then you could sort of dial it up or down. Then we can extend it a little bit more, so we can include things like Tumblr's early efforts to do hashtag filtering, right? So a similar idea that you might, it's still there, it can be found in certain ways, but that the kind of mechanisms by which you'd find it are going to reduce its distribution in certain ways. We could argue that Reddit's quarantine policy does this in a certain way. So once they've quarantined a subreddit, you can still go there and read the content, but anything from that subreddit is never going to make it to the front page. So again, kind of like a wide distribution gets muffled, but the local distribution is still there. And then my favorite was Spotify, sort of a clumsy effort to pull a few artists from its playlist. So it made a very particular distinction that said artists like R. Kelly will be in the archive. They can be added to a user playlist, but they won't be on Spotify's playlists, right, like Rap Caviar. They had to pull back on that from criticism that followed. But a similar idea of them seeing different kinds of responsibility about different kinds of distribution that they had to act differently about. This is a really important thing. So one distinction that's being made is that moderation and recommendation are somehow separate, even though we're seeing ways in which they can work together. But there's a second set of distinctions that are happening here. So all of these reduction policies seem to depend on the platform itself being distinguished into components in which the platform believes or acts like it has different kinds of responsibility, right? So if YouTube says the video will be there, you can get to it how? You can get to it by a link provided, you can get to it by the search mechanism maybe, but that the recommendation column where it is providing it for you, that video will either not appear or will be much less likely to appear, right? This kind of distinction, Spotify is doing a very subtle one where it's like there's the archive, there's the user playlist, there's the Spotify certified playlist, and each of those has a different sort of sense of platform responsibility. We can imagine a kind of like quite subtle distinction of all these different components, right? Facebook likes to talk about connected content and unconnected content. Connected means, you know, I'm friends with James, so when James posts, I get it. That means it was my responsibility because I chose to friend James. And so the fact that it was delivered is on him and on me, but not on Facebook, right? But if Facebook recommends a page, says, oh, based on your interest, you might like this group, that was unconnected from the social graph. It wasn't based on links and clicks and connections. So it was them that was doing it, right? It's a subtle distinction. You could decide that the responsibility lives very differently. But once they draw those partitions, they can then imagine two things. One is that the responsibility is different in different portions, and that it's okay to intervene on half and not all, right? So in some ways, removing a video means it's taken out of all those things. It's not in the archive, it's not showing up in your subscription list, it's not showing up in your recommendation. A reduction technique focuses on one element. It says, for YouTube, that column on the right is a different thing, right, in their mind, whether they think that or whether that's a way to describe the difference. I think this kind of responsibility terrain that's being built across these things, and it's not always spatial, right? So it could sort of be like zones of the platform, but we can imagine like YouTube having different rules for their partners who get ad revenue, right? So now the user population is kind of broken into two categories or more than two categories, and the sense of responsibility, the application of rules can differ across those, right? Twitter makes different rules for politicians and celebrities. That's a kind of distinction as well. Facebook's infamous cross-check program where they were kind of putting a whole bunch of people onto a list that got different moderation techniques. All of these are making distinctions in the parts of the platform such that distinct responsibilities and techniques can be imposed and justified. And I don't want to treat this as a social media thing, so we could think about the way a traditional newspaper has a different idea of what its job is for the front page, for the op-ed column, for the classified, right? And we understand those become conventional, right? We get that we're supposed to think about those sites differently, and getting onto them and what's allowed and whose job it is to say no to something differs across those three. And of course, we should highlight advertising as a fourth category that has very different rules and expectations. Okay, so this will be obvious to some people, but I want to highlight how it's done because in some ways a couple of years ago, most users didn't understand anything about how moderation was done, and we sort of argued that that kind of, not just transparency, but kind of familiarity with the workings is an important part of drawing these things into the light. So not surprisingly, the approach on how to do this is the classic Silicon Valley one. Let's get a bunch of human raters to evaluate some content and train a classifier such that it will identify that content for us. Facebook and YouTube do it a little differently. So Facebook uses the same classifiers that it uses to spot things it will remove. And it sort of goes, literally, if it hits a certain score, we'll remove it or review it for removal. If it hits a slightly lower score, we could reduce it. YouTube, when they approached this design, a different classifier, said they wanted to find misinformation, conspiracy content, and so they developed a separate classifier that would spot borderline content. I think it's interesting to think about the way that when YouTube says we're going to remove problematic content, or when Jigsaw says we're going to get rid of toxicity by training a classifier on human beings who have been asked to look for problematic content or toxicity, but their very understanding of what counts as toxic or problematic came from the practices of platforms themselves, then we get into this kind of like computational tautology problem where we think we're identifying something that people recognize, but it's already the product of a decade of interacting with platforms and their policies. So once the content has been identified by this classifier, then there's a couple things that can happen. So that content can basically be taken out of this recommendation process in one of two ways. One is that it never goes into the inventory, so it's never going to get recommended, right? That identification that says this is probably conspiracy content, right? This is a flat earth video, says it'll never go into that first step of let's find a couple hundred things to recommend to you. It'll never show up in the recommendation column. Or it can go into the candidate generation, but in the relative ranking about novelty and how many people liked this and how many of your friends, this recognition that it's problematic counts against it, so it's less likely to be recommended. But presumably it could be, right, down the list, or if it really fit your profile or what have you. And so there's sort of like not recommend at all, and there's not recommend much. Then there's also, we could do this for all users, or we could do it for some users. And what some users mean could be children, unsubscribed, people in different regions, whatever, you know, by time of day, by whatever they indicated their preference was. Lots and lots of ways where that ability to reduce to some population rather than all could be finessed as, you know, in as sophisticated a way as possible. Okay. I want to skip over these slides. I'll go back to them if you want. It's important to recognize, I really like the timeline that Ellen laid out about these kind of zones of concern, right? What was happening in sort of 2014 and 2016 and 2020. One of the things I find interesting is that in some ways, this concern that I'm raising is of Ellen's 2021 period, right? It's the system question. But in some ways, I think what the platforms were responding to was a burst of concern in 2017 and 2018 that followed on that huge concern about Cambridge Analytica and election stuff. But instead of saying Facebook becomes an environment in which manipulators and misinformers and propagandists can act, there was an increasing call to say that the recommendation system was playing a particular role. YouTube came under a lot of scrutiny in the end of 2017 and 2018 with like the Parkland shooting, right? It wasn't just that there were videos that were discounting the event, but that they were the first ones to show up at the top of the list, right? So that recommendation system was giving them air in a way that whatever regular news clips weren't able to compete. So this growing argument that says that the platform's amplification is part of the problem becomes part of the reason to say, well, the opposite of amplification is reduction, right? How do we intervene in the algorithm and say bad things will go down less? That crisis actor video that's criticizing Parkland kids is going to somehow be brought down, right? Because it's conspiracy. Right, so these become sort of two sides of the same whole. And whenever we see two sides of the same whole, we have to imagine what's the presumption upon which they both exist, right? That these systems are about visibility, and that greater visibility is always the good, right? So therefore, the good should be amplified and the bad should be reduced. That itself is something we can question. Okay, so a couple big concerns, but the obvious one is the question of accountability. So there's a gut part of me that wants to say this is an extremely problematic technique. Because we're good at being critics and we're good at doubting all the things that platforms do. There's a little part of me that says maybe this is the most sophisticated thing platforms have done yet, right? When you recognize that there is a question of like, if you want to separate kind of legal and if you want to separate illegal speech and say this should be prohibited, and you want to have a different criteria for like, what's a sort of good circulation and bad, this kind of intervention that says, we want to let people say something that's idiotic or dangerous, but we don't want to give it breadth, right? We want to sort of have speech but not reach, is Rene DeResta's phrase. Then maybe this kind of like, of course we have to curate, right? How dare we think we shouldn't have curated? In fact, we were curating all the time. We just weren't doing it particularly deliberately. So one view is that this is actually like the most sophisticated thing they're doing, but it may also be the most precarious at the same time. Those things are both possible. The main thing is that it's nearly impossible, I think, to be transparent about these policies, right? So at least when things are removed and we have the kind of like Santa Clara initiative and say you should identify that it's gone, right? You do because there's a trace, right? There's an empty YouTube page or there's like this tweet's been removed. Maybe also there can be an accountability process about the fact that it was removed, an appeals process. How do you demonstrate that something circulated less than it would have otherwise, right? There's a informational problem, like how do you even do that? But there's a more fundamental problem, which is like reduced according to what? Like, and compared to what? How do you measure what the normal distribution should have been? We're living in an environment where the very idea of what should go wide, what should go viral, is itself a product of how platforms have worked for 15 years, right? So to say this would have gone to X, but we pulled a lever and it now went to Y, is a very hard thing to articulate, especially because the X is so dependent on other things, right? Who saw something first and what it was competing against and all these other factors, right? It asks this question about what is the normal reach of content, and there is no exact answer to that. There's provisional answers to that, but not exact ones. And this is why, I think, the closest we've gotten, why users are so suspicious and concerned about these kind of mechanisms, it is that lack of fundamental trust. The platforms have burned the trust of users for years now, right? But when you are in fact enacting these policies and adjusting the circulation of content through mechanisms that can't be transparent on policies that aren't being discussed widely, the closest we can get is communities like LGBTQ activists, sex workers going, something is happening, we're not sure what. We look at things that should have circulated and didn't. We look at things that should have earned money and didn't, and we can anecdotally collect evidence that something's happening. And it's kind of shameful that that's the best evidence we have of these practices. The reason I don't love the word shadow banning is because the platforms have been able to pull a trick on the groups who accuse them of it. Because shadow banning has a much more specific meaning from a long time ago, which was you can see your content, but no one can see it. So when sex workers say our videos are being shadow banned, right, Twitter can say, no, that's not a thing. Are they being reduced? Of course they are, right? According to like, you know, front page news that says, Facebook says we don't let misinformation stuff circulate as widely as it would otherwise, right? So we've got this weird split where it's acknowledged in one place and it's obscured in another. Beyond the question of kind of accountability and transparency, I think there's sort of two remaining questions. One is that if we're going to think about the right policy measures, the right socio-technical regulatory approaches to content moderation, we can't leave out this as not just a piece of what platforms are doing, but I think a very large and now commonplace piece of what they're doing, right? And that goes for not just reduction, but sort of all of these other removal techniques and, you know, adjustment techniques and geo-blocks. All those things have to be a bigger picture of what counts as content moderation. And I would go further. So when, you know, when Facebook is accused of having sort of allowed, you know, January 6th insurrection content to circulate, and they say, we're going to sort of de-emphasize the political because, you know, everybody's sort of angry about polarization. That's moderation. We're going to de-emphasize the political. It's very different than saying that video broke a rule and it's gone. It's to say a category of content judged according to our criteria and technologies will be relatively displaced by other categories, right? That is a moderation gesture. If we widen the definition of moderation, that says there are adjustments made to the visibility and circulation of content based on categories of propriety, offense, harm, rather than preference, efficiency, you know, tastiness. If content moderation includes these interventions, removing, reducing, personalizing, categorizing, rewarding, and elevating, because even the ones that seem sort of neutral can be brought in to be value judgments, right? The difference between what's in the Amazon corpus and what's on the bestseller list, right? The bestseller list should be numerical by purchase, but it's not. They don't include adult content. right? So popular adult content doesn't make the bestseller list. That seems minor and obvious, but it's this reminder that these mechanisms always bleed together. And we know from the tradition of media history that these decisions about what belongs there because the audience wants it, what belongs there because it's earning revenue, and what doesn't belong there because it offends sensibilities always intermingle and get justified by each other's terms. They aren't clean distinctions. It forces us to ask a wider question, which is to say, how do we end up seeing what we see on platforms? What are all the ways, right? And to refuse that distinction, that moderation and the removal of the bad and organization and the promotion of the good are somehow separate concerns, right? But we know that in practice they work in tandem, both because they collectively shape what we see, but also because they can be used in tandem, right? To do one under the terms of the other and to be justified away so it doesn't sort of earn the scrutiny that moderation techniques do. And I would say, again, like to bring us back to the legal question, if we're not careful and we start to pass a set of laws in Europe or here that are concerned about content moderation, but what they mean is you have bad stuff, you will be notified to remove it and have to act in certain ways. That's well and good, right? But if the sophisticated technique that is emerging is plenty of stuff will be reduced, but still be there, then all those concerns have kind of like already missed the window, right? They've already sort of, they're sort of like out of date the day they start. The second, let me go back. The second thought I have at the end is that it's interesting to find out why some things are not thought of as content moderation, some things are. What gets deemed a non-controversial intervention in the name of quality versus what gets deemed as a controversial intervention that's balancing harm and speech depends on these really subtle distinctions about what they're called, about where they happen in the platform, where they happen in the company, what expertise they draw on. So is this a trust and safety concern? Is this an algorithmic design concern? And I think that if we, again, take the lessons of media history, we know that questions of quality and questions of harm are never separate, right? But they get built into separate projects and separate expertise. The deeper challenge, I think, is that if we finally learn that there's no such thing as not moderation, it may be that there's no such thing as curation either, right? We get nervous about the curatorial sensibilities, but my feeling is that what we either have is curation or the obfuscation of curation because it seems technical or obvious or built in, right? The platforms make design decisions, they make categorical decisions, they have ideas about what things are good and useful, right? And they instill those all the time, but they can aver the fact that they're curating because they're not gatekeepers in some traditional media sense, right? I think in some ways, especially in this moment where we now have sophisticated content moderation mechanisms and we're trying to build sophisticated legal regimes that are going to address them, those may be good, but they are very likely going to reify the way we think about moderation, the way we think about what counts as a platform, the way we think about the separation between removal of bad and promotion of good. I think I'll end with Joan's challenge that she started us with at the beginning, right? The call that these platforms should be treated as media companies because they should have the kind of curatorial obligation and the kind of ill fit that represents between sort of like what that's saying they are and the complexity and reality of these platforms. I hear that call to say, hey, they're like media companies, not as a useful characterization, but as a ill-articulated expression that the current regime of responsibility is insufficient. And when I say, should we think of them as media companies, what I want to say is, let's not presume they're media companies, but the answer to that call might be that given their complexity, given their reach, they may earn greater responsibility than media companies, not equal. I'll leave it at that, but I would love to talk about all of this. And there's a free copy of the book. Thank you.
So that was very interesting. Thank you for addressing the media company question. So I understand, I think you made clear that it's very difficult to distinguish between something that should be eliminated from our catalog of, our whatever company this is. And something that should not be eliminated, but that should not be disseminated very actively. I agree with that. So it's difficult, but I'd like to put in a plug maybe for the appeal of that distinction, because I know in various seminars and courses that I've taught where computer science and law comes up, there's the question of public records and the question of just how there's all of this information that in theory was always, in principle, was always public. Like you could go down to the courthouse and ask them to get out this dusty box from the basement and paw through it. Or if you were really intent on finding something out, you could hire an investigator and spend a lot of, but the point is that very few people are going to do that. So there was no harm in having birth records and death records and marriage records and divorce records and property ownership records, and all these things could be public records, but for most of us, the records of our personal lives were not going to be dug up. That's all changed now that everything's online. Now, anybody who sort of just wants to make mischief, can start Googling stuff and find out stuff that maybe really shouldn't be public. Right. Like maybe it should be in this category where, yes, if you are very motivated, if you have a very good reason to go look this stuff up, it's technically feasible to do it. But the government is not going to make it easy for you if you don't have a very good reason. Right. And I agree that this is not very well defined, but it does have some appeal in that things used to be, officially public, but practically not so public. And maybe that's what these content aggregators or disseminators are saying, we're not going to censor this. We're not going to eliminate this because we don't really have a good, an ironclad reason for doing so. But we're not going to make it easy for you to find it either.
Yeah. I mean, I would quibble with the first sentence, which is that it's not difficult to distinguish which things should go in removal and which things should go in reduction. It is conventional. It's whatever the platforms decide, right?
They might be making wrong decisions.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, but again, wrong is not like there's a fundamental wrong. Wrong is, shouldn't this be open for debate somewhere, right? So it becomes a question of how obscure these practices are. I don't think there's a problem at all between imagining that these systems could make a distinction between what is in the archive and what is likely to appear in a delivery system. I don't think that by itself is a problem. In fact, the platforms do it all the time, right?
And
so
it might have social value.
Yeah, so the place to me where it doesn't quite fit onto the example of the record is sitting in a dusty office is that it's not clear that a YouTube video that didn't get distributed but is sitting there is hard to find either, right? It's a question of what's the nature of that built-in barrier, right? So the built-in barrier of it being in a filing cabinet somewhere in your town hall versus the fact that it sort of instantly, can be brought up on a screen. That difference compared to the difference of the YouTube video is there, but it doesn't show up on the what's next list for some people some of the time. Those are both easy. It becomes this question of
do you know to look for?
Yeah, that's right. So the sort of discovery question matters because I might never stumble across this thing. So it is making a different distinction, which is known content continues to circulate and unknown. It really makes a difference between you won't find it if you don't know about it versus you will find it. All of these distinctions, this is where the self-harm type content where they really worry about it, where it's the big worry is the person who doesn't know to look for it versus the content of lone wolf people looking for maybe white national stuff will find increasingly extreme stuff is a will look for it, right? So which of those distinctions we find imperative is itself a definition of what does it mean to provide a public venue, right? Should that venue be, if you looked for it, you're going to get it, or should it be as long as you're not looking for it, you'll never see it? Those are very different ideas of what publicness is. And that to me is built into all of these decisions about what you use this tool for. So there's both the fact of the tool should be more known, right, which is a very hard thing to do, and the what do you imagine using it for. That's why I showed that the YouTube algorithm video, because taking it out from all recommendation is very different than taking it out of some recommendation, because who's going to get it in the sum? It's not random, right? It's something that was very suited for. It was something that really fit, or someone who was willing to dig down through recommendations. So it makes a difference between sort of sum all versus interested, not interested, right? And those themselves, that's a consequential distinction.
So, very interesting, unsettling talk about unsettling practices of handling unsettling material.
You're welcome.
I'm interested in another distinction that you seem to be gliding around a lot throughout this talk. And people make this distinction, again, that may not stand up, between search and recommendation.
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking about this problem in the context of search, where people go out and look for particular material, and the search engine has to decide what to return and how to rank it.
Yeah.
And people made the same distinction between delisting and downranking or upranking, with the same problems, that it's really hard to define a baseline of the correct ranking in the abstract.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the context of search, I settled on an answer that I convinced myself of, at least, that we should judge the practices according to a baseline of what the user doing the search is looking for. What serves their autonomy in finding the information that they want, rather than looking at the interests of the websites whose content is being ranked. And I think it holds up coherently there. But I've never been satisfied with the attempt to try to extend that to recommendation systems that aren't driven by a specific query looking for particular things.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what your take on how much we can and can't do by appealing to the viewer or reader or listener autonomy in the context of recommendation systems on these various platforms.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. I hear the people who do search getting to define what they do is very different than recommendation, right? So being able to say there is an expectation of indexing, and so the kinds of things that we're willing to not provide are much more circumscribed than a recommendation system. Nevertheless, there are places where they're willing to delist or demote. And let's remember this question about sort of like a responsibility terrain. Google feels very different about autocomplete, right? Where it says, we're putting words in your mouth, so we have to be much more careful about what we won't say than the fact that something shows up fourth on a list of links. That said, let me think about the thing you were saying about, like, can we lean on what users want? It strikes me that really comes back to Sarah's point at the end of her talk, where like some of our moderation concerns are about someone getting something they don't want, so then we can use their want as the kind of defining factor. So there was a cryptographic concern, but there's also kind of like an ethical concern. If you searched for it, you got it. It's kind of Facebook's idea that says if we friended ourselves and I'm suddenly offended by things you sent, that's not on Facebook, right? That's sort of on me. I can disconnect or whatever. I can unfriend, exactly. Versus the point of like, there are things we call public harms that the people involved don't object to, right? And so I think about the argument about data voids, right? So like, what do you do in search if people have been able to produce content around a phrase that doesn't really have a counter, so that when people search for that phrase, right, so if they look for crisis act, or if they look for, black on white violence, or if they look for Holocaust denial, there aren't a million web pages that say Holocaust denial, nope, it happened. There are a bunch of pages that proscribe Holocaust denial. There are very few, but when you do that search in the right way, those things win the day. So now you've got this really tricky thing where like, did the want explain what the platform should or should not have done, or do we also have to think about collective public harms? So I think that gets really tricky. So if we bring this back to the recommendation space, we both have the, you could lean on the user and say they probably don't want anti-vax, they probably don't want flat earth. So I don't want to load them with it just because it's out there and the people who made the videos would like them to be seen. But so you could get away with that part of it, but I don't want to let go of the public harm question that says there might be people who are perfectly willing to want that, but we still might want it not to circulate. Or let's flip it around, right? its ability to gain traction had to do with the tendency for that platform to amplify it. That's the amplification argument that I think we're still grappling with and finding a language that says it's only enjoyed its prominence because it understood how to game that system. So the system should compensate for the fact that it was already doing something wrong, right? That's a tricky argument, but I don't want to discount it because I think it asks a public harm question and a system responsibility question that we're not nearly as good at asking about, but I don't want to let go of.
This is so great, Tarleton. I want to make a couple of observations, do with them what you will. On the search question, you didn't use the word paternalism, you're calling them public harms, but
Yeah.
there is, and to me it reminds me of Right to be Forgotten on search, which does have this aspect of what Joan's talking about, which is that you de-index the name, the material on a search for the name, but it's still there. But it's still there.
Right.
I view that as introducing friction. And so, and in a way, it's a little bit like the public square, right? So how do we treat real space speech or analog speech? As we say, some people have a lot of amplification, some messages have a lot of amplification. There's always the public square for everyone else. And in a way, you've got to then hustle to get your voice heard. So in a way, it's like that. On what are policymakers getting or not getting, I actually think they're onto this.
Okay.
And so there are a lot of bills now that talk about algorithms and recommendation engines, and you see that in the DSA. Right. But what I think, and I think your responsibility terrain is so useful and would be so useful in that space because, there's this search for this neutrality, this like holy grail of neutrality, which you guys have talked about. And the way policymakers are dealing with it is they're using like, reverse cron as the neutral terrain. Like that's the unrecommended, which of course it's not, and it could never work. Right. And so I do think the other thing so they want for users to be able to toggle between recommendation and reverse cron. The other sort of mechanism that they're using is liability in cases where it's been recommended. And that gets to your responsibility terrain and also to your point about the informational problem, because I think, how would you ever know that the harm that you're seeking redress for came about because of a recommendation as opposed to some sort of more organic process? Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, two little comments, but that is super helpful. One is that I see legal efforts that are trying to talk about the impact of recommendation. What I feel like they are generally doing is assuming that because we talk about bias of systems, right, that the algorithmic mechanism that is trying to personalize will have biased consequences, which is different than saying this tool that is for personalization is also being used for moderation. That's the part that I think, like, because of the separation, I haven't seen that part of it, but I'm willing to find it in places you would know these better than I would. The other one is that I want to point out, the kind of like responsibility terrain. While I think that work of saying like, okay, what if the column of recommendation is very different than the subscription channel? What if the search results are very different than the autocomplete? Those things make sense, and of course we do try to lean on them and say, okay, well there could be a reverse cron and a privileged. But I also want to remember that those things are not distinct. They change over time, right? They are conventional only in a moment because YouTube wants them to be conventional, right? Get it? Just like op-ed is different than, front page is different than advertiser promoted interstitial. Oh, we didn't mark that. Okay, well maybe we'll call them both op-eds, right? That game of kind of separating them and then blending them over time happens all the time. So we have to be careful. And we wouldn't want to, that's also a place of innovation, right? We talk about competition and more actors would create innovation, but another place that innovation happens is to say, we've got all these sites that just have reverse cron and algorithmic relevance. Someone's going to come up with a third one, right? And that's a kind of innovation that then creates opportunities, right? So I think that terrain distinction happens all the time, but we wouldn't want to like sit on it too hard in some ways. Yeah.
Hi, Tarleton.
Yeah, hey.
Thanks so much for this talk. I'm Gabe, starting at CS UChicago next year. One spot that I thought was really interesting I want to go back to is you sort of said underlying this framework of amplification and reduction is this presumption that greater visibility is sort of always good, or like for these platforms, maybe said another way, they're optimizing for engagement. What are some alternatives to sort of that idea? And if we, what might these platforms look like with different presumptions.
Right, right. That's good. Yeah, I'm doing the like old structuralist technique where we go like, I hear an opposite everyone's fighting over, and so we have to guess like what's the structural commonality. You're doing the hard question that says, well, what is it if it's not that? So that's really difficult. I think in some ways, like there's good scholarship that's coming out. I'm thinking about Jessa Lingle in particular, but there are other ones that are thinking about communities that have used online tools, whether it's the mega platforms that we all talk about or whether it's homegrown, to be visible to each other but small, right? So, she writes about, the punk community in this town and the kind of body modification group in that town that have both a desire to be sort of found to the right people, but be obscure, and they don't want virality, right? That's not the goal. So I wouldn't want to hold that as the oppose, but it is one that I think of where we say, if we imagine, if we go back to kind of like the dream of web community / early platforms, it was not necessarily, I want to make the video of my kid biting the other kid's finger that has 100 million views. It was like, can I find pockets of people to which I matter and matter to me? That's still true. You can still do it, right? That's sort of still what Reddit's dedicated to. But the call to virality and the clear rewards, financial and otherwise, that now accumulate to virality is a powerful pull. If we treat that as natural and be like, everyone wants to be seen, that's a mistake, right? People want to be seen, but that's only in a context in which seenness is rewarded and protected. And then we fight this battle about kind of like seenness and the exploitation of systems that make you seen and the kind of like harm of not being seen. Already we're kind of oriented towards fixing that problem based on a premise. There are other people who are trying to assemble, which is not the same as trying to be visible, right, in the same way. So that's one way to kind of remember that there's other dimensions. There's probably other ones that are other social formations that are not about more is better, right, that have other criteria.
Thanks, Tarleton.
Yeah.
My question was on a device that just the battery ran out on, so I'm going to try and
You'll have to
reconstruct
recreate it, yeah.
It was about the politics of defining the problem, and I think it was an invitation for you to go into a bit more detail there about what is the politics that you're seeing as to why platforms in particular are very interested to talk about specific content being removed as the extent of the content moderation problem and not go into that.
Yeah.
The role that recommendation algorithms play and so on.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of come back to that. And it seems to me that there are very strong reasons why platforms would be loath to do that. One, because it goes to the core of the business model of the platforms themselves. And secondly, there is a kind of symbiotic relationship now where states have something that they can review via transparency reports, so long as we're talking about the removal of content. And platforms have a story that they can tell about being transparent around their content moderation decisions.
Yeah.
If you go further, and I'm thinking of the kind of terrorism and extremism space, there was a recommendation in the Christchurch call to action, for example, by the French government, where they said, we actually want transparency to include the role of recommendation algorithms and the role that platforms play in enhancing and amplifying extremist content.
Yeah.
And my observations of being inside the GIF-CT over the last couple of years has been, there's been a concerted effort just to shrink that entire problem out of existence because, one, what would it look like? Well, you couldn't answer that question through a transparency report.
Yeah, yeah.
That means that the platforms would have to have some kind of external oversight over the role that their algorithms are playing in enhancing content, and that could lead to all kinds of problems. So I'm just wondering if you could just say a bit more about the politics behind why you see the problem being defined in this way and what opportunities you see in the current landscape for disrupting that to widen the debate.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll play out, I can hear competing tensions inside of my own intellectual training that will want to answer you different ways. So I'm just going to do all three of them. One is that we, of course, have to look for the kind of structural, the kind of interest motivation, right? So there are certain things that it would be harder to be transparent about, and being able to define them as something that you didn't have to be transparent about helps, right? So kind of like very tactical kind of political economy theory that says, I'm being called to be transparent. I will do that to the degree that I am obligated to, / it serves my interest, / it's feasible to do. And there's a whole aspect of this business, like, please don't make me talk about what ads I took down as a moderation effort, because that's a bit different part of my business, right? And it would only be when we call upon them, we collectively, to say, that's content and it's moderation, so you have to tell me about that too, and force those things to not be separate, right? So that's the kind of political economy answer, that of course people are seeking what is in their self-interest or their, institutional interest. There's a different part of me that wants to say, like, these are so much about kind of like frameworks of understanding, right? People come to these questions through different expertise. I'm really curious to hear from the computer scientists. My sense is that the people who do recommender systems, that field, information retrieval, don't think much about that being a moderation technique. It's very much like there's a pile of information, we want to give people the right way through it, but that's an outsider's view. So maybe those fields have been debating all along, like, Jesus, when we don't recommend something, we're also not granting it visibility. What are the aggregate effects of that? I don't know if that's part of the conversation, but I do think when you see in these platforms, there's a kind of conventional / disciplinary difference about who's doing this work and thinking about a trust and safety concern and an algorithmic design concern, such that they just come to the problem with different terms, and it doesn't appear to be something that they would ever have to hold to transparency and speech and what have you, right? And then the third is, like, these are probably ad hoc, right? I think much of this stuff happens in the moment, right? So it's some weird combination of those things about what you understand and what looks feasible, and that's not nefarious, can be, but it's not nefarious by definition. It's like making do, right? But it accretes these distinctions. The last thing I'll say is that the one that I'm really left with, this is the sort of thing I think I want to write a paper on next, is like, why clickbait quickly became not a speech question. So I think there were early moments when people were angry about clickbait, and Facebook was saying they were going to not do something about it and do something about it, where there was sort of a glimmer of like, this affects journalism, and what counts as, sort of a clicky baity thing. But very quickly, I think, and on purpose, Facebook defined it away as a quality control issue, negotiated with some of the major players like BuzzFeed to say, don't worry, you won't get affected by this. Screwed over other sites like Demand Media and said, you're done. Partnered with Washington Post and New York Times to make sure they'd have a privileged position, such that all of those things, like, we didn't say someone's speech is being erased. We don't say that about spam, like somebody's speech, because we don't care for it the way we care about heated public debate. Right? So how is that possible? And by the end of that thing, clickbait disappears inside of fake news when that sort of takes over. So you see moments in 2016 where Facebook will say all of the concerns about fake news, misinformation, propaganda, and clickbait, and it's just become like a fourth category. And then you look at these YouTube posts where they're announcing borderline content, and they go, we dealt with clickbait, we dealt with the things you said you didn't want, now we're going to deal with conspiracy, as if that's a lineage, right? So it's amazing to me that clickbait just got kind of like, it's like it's a consumer, newsy, bad product problem, and it's Facebook's legitimate and unproblematic job, except in the eyes of someone who's going to kind of lose, to go ahead and get rid of that for us. But when we say, like, get rid of, like, hateful political speech, we go, yeah, but, right? And we freak out because we have a kind of full-blown First Amendment reaction to it. I just find that really fascinating. And I think that work, like, you can watch Facebook over several years, define clickbait and then define it away as something that they should get rid of, rather than, are you sure we have to deal with this? We don't want to be arbiters of truth, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah? More? Or are we out?
We're out of time.
Okay.
We ran out of time. Hopefully, I saw at least a couple more questions. Hopefully we can continue the discussion at the break.
Gladly. Thank you.
Thank you.